All right, so we're just going to get right into it?
Yeah.
All right, I'm Devin, and our project's focused on black music, so I'm doing the origins of black music from Western Africa.
I'm Kayanna, and as he said, our project focuses on music, so my section is more about, like, Negro spirituals.
I'm Ashanti, and I'm going to be talking to you guys about R&B.
I'm Karrington. I'm going to be covering blues music, its history.
I'm Olivia, and I'll be talking about hip-hop from the 1970s to today.
Awesome. And I am Ian, and I'll be talking about rock and the origins, focusing around the 1950s.
So my selection comes from, it's a Mande folk song, and that's a tribe in Western Africa. Today they live in Mali and the Niger River Valley. The reason I chose this is because this is the music that traveled on the ships with the slaves, and that the foundation of black music today. For the people of West Africa, their music was functional, and it was also a form of art, a form of self-expression. They used their music to preserve their family history and cultural history. For them, music and spirituality were closely linked, and for all major ceremonies and things like that, so funerals, weddings, stuff of that nature, they had music that was playing. For them, one of the most important functions was storytelling. There wasn't a written language originally, and so they used their music to pass down through generations of their family history, cultural history, things of that sort. The features of African music from West Africa, they can still be heard in music today. So the call and response style, you can hear it in gospel really, really well, and in rap music today. Quavo. So on his song, How About That, he poses a question in the hook, and he answers immediately after that.
How about the whole gang get geek? Yeah, yeah. How about the whole gang get freaks? Yeah, yeah. How about that?
And so that's an example of what that would be. You can't really hear it well in the original track because you don't understand what they're saying, but here you hear very neatly where he's asking, I think, how about the whole gang get geeked? And then he answers, yeah, yeah. So it comes immediately after, and that's what that's all about. Another feature that you can hear in music today would be blue notes. So what that is you're playing notes in a different key, and it gives it an eerie sound, a dark sound. And you can hear that in people from Miles Davis to Ray Charles and even Future. They all use blue notes to give their music that down-tempo, eerie style. Another feature that you can hear is improvisation. So that's really, really prominent in jazz and rap. So freestyling and then scat singing from people like Ella Fitzgerald, all of that comes from West Africa.
So when you're talking about like that oral history, I mean, that directly ties to the oral traditions and the musicians that we were learning about kind of for that first test.
Uh-huh.
So like that's directly straight in line with that history.
Yes, absolutely. So a lot of, like, for them, storytelling was very, very important because that's how you pass things on. So you have griots and the elders in the family, things like that. Like that all ties into their music. Like all of that is an important part of how they were able to communicate and pass things along. Just transitioning to the next part, their music, spiritual connotations, that was something very important that got passed along, and then you can hear that in music from early African American music.
I did my section on Negro spirituals and field songs. So most of the songs were built with, like, their African roots in them. However, because the slave masters were, for lack of a better word, enforcing Christianity, they covered up what they were actually speaking about with Christian values, and most of the songs, they had a purpose or a message in them that they were trying to get to the other slaves, which is why most of them are very short and repetitive. They had many different purposes. Originally, they were used to boost the overall happiness of the other slaves on the field. However, as the years go on and the songs began to progress, they became more so of songs for celebration and songs to help the repetitive chores go by, and obviously songs to talk to the other slaves about the Underground Railroad and means of escape. Harriet Tubman used the song "Wade in the Water" as a signal to the slaves that she was traveling with to get off of the trails and into the rivers, so as to throw off the bloodhounds that were tracking them.
Well, then why not every man? Now didn't my Lord deliver Daniel well?
When Nat Turner was doing his rebellions, obviously he was a preacher first, so he would sing certain songs that would invoke a spirit within the people he was preaching to. And when his actual revoltings began, it was very common to hear drums, because that's how he initiated their attacks. Which is why in 1740, the year after his rebellion was ended, the Negro Act came out, in which the drums were banned from slaves. They couldn't use it, and they couldn't assemble, amongst other things. This basically sets up the foundation for the blues that would come later on.
So, like, I never really thought of, like, how the outlawing of the drums set up the, like, next genre of music, I guess you could say, like, with the blues. And I think that's really, I think it's really important, and it's really cool, like, how we just, like, shifted differently.
Forced them to use other instruments.
Yeah.
That's one of the cool parts about the musical history, is because it wasn't just rhythm and it wasn't just melody. You know, it was kind of a cultural community aspect. That's a heavy realization, you know.
Yeah.
That's cool.
And then because the songs were made by slaves for other slaves, like most times they have this eerie tone to them because they're always sad, and there's always this deep soulfulness within the songs. And so when I was like going through the different versions of Wade in the Water, I would go through the comments, and like there would be so many people talking about, oh, they didn't sing it right, there's not enough soul in it, where's the pain? So like it's crazy to see like how even today we as African Americans hold these songs very close to us, even though we don't necessarily sing them or need them anymore.
The song I'm using to transition is by Ma Rainey. It's Prove It On Me.
When I last night had a
The message in this song is about her independence from society's norms and her lesbianism. And blues talked a lot about lifestyle and how society treated black people. Blues was developed in the South in the post-Civil War era. It was influenced by field haulers, church music, ragtime, folk music, minstrel shows, and popular music during that time. Blues lyrics conveyed emotions of sadness due to lost love, oppression, and cruelty from white people in difficult times. Blues is essentially a vocal form music. Performers use techniques such as melisma, which means that they held a single syllable over multiple pitches. Performers use syncopation, rhythmic technique, that involve disturbances in the regular flow of rhythm. The use of guitar, piano, harmonica, trombone, and bass are prominent in blues. The earliest form of blues were African spirituals. In 1867, the first collection of African spirituals were published until approximately 1877. At that point, a lot of laws, such as the rise of Jim Crow, came about, and caused restrictions on music for black people and discouraged them from making music because of racial tension and lynching until about the 1900s. All right. In 1902, Victor Record makes the first known recording of black music known as Camp Meeting Shouts. In 1903, William Christopher Handy, also known as the father of blues, discovered blues while in Mississippi when he discovered a man playing guitar with a knife. In 1912, the first blues song sheets were published, which included Handy's Memphis Blues. And in 1917, the Great Migration began due to the United States entering World War I. This caused black people to move from the south to the north, entering big cities in search of better opportunities, away from the south. In 1920, Mary Smith publishes her blues record, Crazy Blues, becoming the first blues hit. This marks the beginning of race recording. And in 1922, Race Records began offering better opportunities for blues musicians and artists, offering more money than they would have earned independently. In 1923, Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey sang at the same show, and the performances brought emotional intensity of blues and popularized it amongst the whites in urban areas. In 1925, Blind Lemon Jefferson kickstarted his blues career and becomes one of the most well-known musicians, influencing others as well. In 1929, Charlie Patton starts recording that for Paramount, also becoming a well-known musician. And the same year, the Great Depression happened, and crippling the recording industry. In 1939, the electric guitar was introduced to the industry, impacting music, not just blues and rock and roll for years to come. 1940, Muddy Waters, recorded by Alan Lomax for the Library of Congress at Stovall's Farm, Mississippi, happened. And also in 1941, the United States entered World War II, causing another migration of blacks to the north. Muddy Waters moves to Chicago, influencing the creation of Electric Chicago Blues in 1943. Muddy Waters was an important connection that linked the style of blues from the Mississippi Delta's blues to urban style blues. Arthur Crudup records That's All Right, that referenced Blind Lemon Jefferson's The Black Snake Moan, and Elvis Presley covered that song for his debut in 1952. In 1962, the Rolling Stones are created as a blues band, and with that emerged British blues bands, and that's it for right now.
A short comment. You talked about ragtime music and minstrel shows.
Yeah.
And that's very early on. It shows that black people were very influential in pop culture, like today, but those were the same people that were being mocked by pop culture. So the people who were influencing and creating the culture are being torn down by it also.
Yeah, that's where a lot of people, like a lot of artists, they suffer ridicule at first, and then over time the music starts getting accepted, and people start recognizing that it's actually kind of cool. It's kind of lit, like Young Thug, his music, and his style was just not looked upon. People thought, this guy's weird, and now look at all the people trying to be like him and his clones. That is the clones. So, it's not just music, just basically anything that's new, different,
You mentioned rock and roll, and that was a big offshoot of blues. Chuck Berry was the father of rock and roll. So he was part of that migration that you had talked about from the South. I think he lived in Missouri, moved up to Chicago, and was working in a factory in like the 1950, 1951, heard a record of blues, and was like, man, this is something. And he latched onto it, and not like he didn't before, but he decided to kind of make that shift from factory work to being a musician. And within 3 years' time, he was signed onto Chess Records with Muddy Waters, with Howlin' Wolf, all of these notable blues players. But what made rock and roll stand out was those jazz and blues rhythms mixed with his kind of country roots. So he kind of merged country western with blues and jazz. We also saw a transition of white musicians doing covers and singing songs that were traditionally what would be called at the time race music. R&B was another title for that, and that would become synonymous for race music, which was synonymous for black music. And so you have this shift because the record labels saw that almost half, I think it was like 45 to 48% of record sales were going to young adult whites. And they said, okay, we need to market to this. And so they started having people like Elvis, Jerry Lee Lewis, Johnny Cash, a lot of that vein of rockers, especially that were coming out of Sun Records. I think that was in Kentucky. They started covering these tunes that had been around for that were known on the R&B scene. Fats Domino, one of the things that he had said was rock and roll was always around. We just called it R&B, and it was known to it. But one of the key features of rock and roll that kind of separated it out was more music kind of catered to the young adult scene. So it covered a lot of those transitional problems of authority and questions of the status quo. And so it really kind of became not necessarily rebellious music, but rebellion was a part of it. And a part of that was this idea of voice and of kind of equal representation and equality as a whole. And that you would see later on in the 60s as some of the Equal Rights Act that we see throughout history. A lot of that has roots in rock and roll. But the crazy part is that even though it's kind of rooted in giving voice and trying to bring equality, it was undercut by the major labels. And so the majors started picking up on this marketing around 55. And so they started trying to re-image and rebrand and emulate this sound, but using white musicians to try to cater to that split, that segregation. And so you have that going on, coupled with a lot of the trials and tribulations that a lot of these musicians had, because a lot of these musicians came from marginalized backgrounds, whether it be poor, people of color, blue-collar professionals, or just young. And so that kind of set up some of the problems that you see. So, for example, like Jerry Lee Lewis, piano player, rocker, he ended up marrying his much younger cousin, and that was very promiscuous. And you had Chuck Berry, who got charged and thrown in jail for a couple years for transporting a minor over state lines. You had musicians that were committing suicide. You had musicians, in the case of Little Richard, who left the profession to become a preacher. And so you had a lot of these establishing artists leave, and then kind of the downfall of a lot of the smaller companies, record labels, that really kind of curtailed a lot of that voice that rock and roll gave to marginalized groups, but especially the African American community.
I want to ask you something.
Yeah.
So what's your take on people saying that Elvis is the king of rock and roll, and do you think it's discrediting to Chuck Berry?
100% discrediting. Because without Chuck Berry, there would be no Elvis.
Girl, you know we belong together.
known as race music, rhythm and blues brings out the manifestation of emotions by the singer or instrument. And the genre became like the mirror for jazz, ballads, church hymns, and other things like gospel. It was first performed by African Americans, of course, and then like it became like personalized with melody and rhythm, and it was known to sometimes imitate the Black African folk songs that were used to communicate in groups or often like in the task among them. The term R&B itself was coined by Jerry Wexler. He was a music journalist and producer, and he coined it in 1949. R&B itself was like a predecessor to rock and roll, and like the 1950s were really I would say the most dominating decade for R&B, but I feel like the 90s was the most influential or whatever. But R&B from like the 80s and today like defined a style of African American music that combines elements of like soul, funk, and pop. So R&B albums have broken many barriers for African Americans in the music industry. Like, for example, Michael Jackson's Thriller, which is the greatest selling album of all time, no matter the genre. It broke racial barriers on MTV and radio, widening their demographic, because at first MTV did not play Black artists' music videos on their channel. And then when Thriller dropped the actual single, they began to play Black artists. And the 90s, which I think personally, and many probably agree with, was like the real last decade where R&B was a very dominant force in Black music. You had artists like Whitney Houston, Boyz II Men, Mariah Carey, Aaliyah, Janet Jackson. They just like evolved the genre, and many important messages were delivered through R&B, especially like with love, and whether it's self-love or just acceptance or acceptance of other people. You have albums like Janet Jackson's The Velvet Rope, which was very influential to African Americans and the LGBT community to like accept themselves. And then distinct ones like Aaliyah's One in a Million, which at the time was arguably the sound of the future with two of pop's biggest innovators, Missy Elliott and Timbaland. Then like in the 2000s, hip-hop and R&B, it was like a mix, and it increased a lot, so there wasn't a way to truly know if a song was R&B besides like whether if the lyrics were rapped or sung. With that being said, many individuals feel modern R&B lacks the soulful rhythmic element, and I want to like ask you guys, do you think today's R&B is having an identity crisis? Because I feel like in the early 2000s, R&B was very dominant, but now it's like got lost. And then with trap music and stuff and rap in general, I feel like rap now is the most dominating force. So do you think R&B lost its identity, basically?
I think times have changed because streaming has made things where it's not really about the quality of the music, and R&B was based heavily on how good it sounded, how good you could sing, what talent did you have.
Right.
And nowadays it's just like, what sounds good, what can you get on the internet to get a bunch of views and a bunch of clicks and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
So quality isn't rewarded the way that it was, and I think that's why R&B's falling off a bit.
Mm-hmm. I don't even necessarily think R&B's falling off. It's just because we're so used to it, because rhythm is just a thing that we've always done.
Yeah.
That like now, because like that's why we're streaming all these new artists and these SoundCloud rappers and et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think R&B is necessarily like falling off. I think it's just, if you want to hear it, you have to search a little bit harder for like quality music.
So we talked about blues, R&B, rock and roll, all these different genres, and hip-hop is basically like a mixture of all those. It was born as an underground movement in the Bronx in the 1970s, and it's been defined as a genre that tells the story of minorities in the United States. So this genre of music has given the oppressed and voiceless a platform to share their stories with the world, and really hip-hop music has always been embedded with messages of activism, outcries against social injustices, and chronicles the various realities of Black people. So I'm going to take you guys on a timeline from the 1970s to today of hip-hop music. So, like I said, the early beginnings of hip-hop can be traced back to the 1970s when pioneers in New York like Grandmaster Flash, DJ Grand Wizard Theodore, and DJ Kool Herc cultivated unique turntabling techniques. And those techniques kind of just shaped hip-hop to be its own distinct category of music. In 1979 was the first time we ever saw a rap song make the Billboard charts, and that song was Rapper's Delight by Sugar Hill Gang.
You see, I'm 6'1" and I'm tons of fun, and I dress to a T. You see, I got more clothes than Muhammad Ali, and I dress so viciously. I got bodyguards, And
the mainstream and commercial success of the song paved the way for other MCs to make it in the record business. And really, one of the most notable rappers from this time was Kurtis Blow, and he was the first rapper to be signed to a record label, and he's really credited with exposing hip-hop to overseas audiences. Transitioning to the 80s, hip-hop continued to flourish, and that's really known as the golden age of hip-hop. And it was the first decade where hip-hop really blew up, and artists that were participating in hip-hop experimented with different sounds, and it began to expand past New York City, to cities like LA, Miami, Florida, Detroit. And one of the biggest acts to rise out of this decade was Run DMC, and they're known for collaborating with the rock group Aerosmith for their remix on Walk This Way, and the work they did together helped expose hip-hop to wider audiences. And this kind of created the subgenre of rock rap, and groups like Public Enemy participated in rock rap as well. And then also at the same time, you had gangster rap developing, and groups like NWA began to use their platform to paint a picture of what life was like for Black people on the West Coast. And their 1988 album, Straight Outta Compton, contained tracks about racial profiling and police brutality. And then also, songs like The Message by Grandmaster Flash and The Furious Five was another one of the defining songs of the subgenre of rap, as it reflected the reality of a life plagued by drugs, crime, poverty, and discrimination. And then some of the other popular rappers from the 80s were MC Lyte, Eric B. and Rakim, LL Cool J, Slick Rick, and Ice-T. Okay, so moving to the 1990s, rap music continued to comment on important social issues. In particular, the racial riots in LA was a pivotal time for hip-hop music. Ice Cube's 1991 album, Death Certificate, discussed rioting, and then Ice-T's song Cop Killer was one of the most controversial records of this decade. Socially conscious rap was also popular, and then the East Coast and West Coast battles was a key factor in the 1990s. Each region began to develop a distinct sound and competed for popularity, and the most well-known representations of each coast are West Coast rapper Tupac and East Coast rapper Biggie. And then some of the other notable artists of the 90s were Nas, Snoop Dogg, Jay-Z, 50 Cent, The Roots, and the No Limit Posse. So the 2000s saw the rise of Southern rap, and while Southern rap existed in the 90s, it began to saturate the airwaves in the 2000s. Crunk music had a major moment in this decade, and Lil Jon and the East Side Boys had their song Get Low, and that's when gained Southern rap serious attention. Other crunk artists were 3 6 Mafia, Yin Yang Twins, Lil Scrappy, and the Youngbloods. And then at the same time, trap music also originated, became popular in it at this time. It originated in Atlanta and talked about life in the streets. Young Jeezy and T.I. are two of the rappers who made the genre of trap music popular. And then also the 2000s was when Lil Wayne was really popular. He's known as one of the most iconic artists of the decade. And by the end of the 2000s, many new branches of hip-hop and sounds had developed, and this continued into the 2010s. And in particular, July 2017, it was declared that hip-hop had surpassed rock as the most consumed genre. Some rappers of the 2010s have continued to use their platform to make music about serious issues, but the 2010s also saw artists using their platform to provide entertainment and rely on comical lyrics and unusual, unique melodies. So many artists of this era rose to fame through the internet and used streaming platforms like SoundCloud. Examples of these internet rappers include Lil Yachty, Odd Future, Playboi Carti, and then other standout mainstream artists from this generation are Drake, Future, 2 Chainz, Migos, Kendrick Lamar, J. Cole, and A$AP Rocky. And then overall, hip-hop has served as a musical reflection on the social, political, and cultural realities of black music, and since the 70s, hip-hop has been an important part of African-American culture and will continue to be for decades. Any particular hip-hop decade stand out to you?
This one, really.
Like the one we're in now?
Yeah, because it kind of irritates me a little.
With like the SoundCloud rappers?
The SoundCloud rappers, yeah. Because I feel like they glorify something different.
Yeah.
Like, not all of us African Americans or like we experience in general. And I feel like you have like other artists who we really need to be a voice right now. And they can't they say what we want and we speak and what we need, but their voice isn't heard because you have other rappers who are on that platform and they're using it to like glorify other things which aren't really that important, or which like some rappers don't even live the lifestyle that they glorify.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's like I feel like it's a waste of time and we could be addressing so many other issues with like stuff that you could hear Kendrick or Cole or other people talk about.
What you gonna do today? Some gonna get a fly girl, gonna get some spank and drive off in a death OJ. Everybody go home.